last VRUG we had, Peter joined us, and he gave a what are containers, what are the, how's that all work? And when we started talking about, things that we could discuss at this one, I'm currently in the process of training up on containers, trying to understand all the key concepts. And I'm sure I'm nowhere near Darius's level, and he could probably do this presentation 10 times better than I could. But I'm going to go ahead and try to give you a primer. So, getting ready for today's meeting, I thought, about putting together a PowerPoint slide with all sorts of, graphics and such. But really, in my brain, I'm trying to just break this down as simple as possible, make it as easy as possible for people to understand what are containers, why are we doing this, how does it work. And I figured just some simple bullets in a notepad would actually work just fine for the type of primer I was wanting to do. Additionally, I'm wanting this to be a discussion, not a lecture or a training session of sorts. So as I'm going through some of these points, I want you to unmute yourself and I want you to ask the question. So I want this to be interactive. I want you guys asking questions, talking about what it is you're seeing, what it is what we're discussing, so that we can have a constructive conversation around all this. So if you go back into Remedy history, at least 5 years, if not even more, when you start looking into what are containers and what are they used for and why you want to be doing containers, you actually see some of the decisions that BMC has been making for the last 5 or 6 years coming into play, because they've been looking certainly that far down the road, if not further, to get themselves into a place where they could actually be implementing a containerized environment. First question is, what is a container? So when I have this sort of discussion with people, they say, well, how does it relate to a VM? So the answer to that is it's a VM minus the OS. So when you're talking about a container shares the operating system with the host operating system. So it's not a separate thing where you're saying, I've got, I'm going to give it, 4 gigs of RAM and 2 CPUs. That's not what a container is. A container is a list of applications that are running off of the same OS that the container is running on. So it's lighter weight. So because there's not Windows inside the container that is doing, that is running a full OS and then the applications on top of it, or a Linux or whatever, it's just the applications themselves. So in my mind, I tend to think of a container as a zip file. And this helps me with the analogy of explaining what a container is, because a container is largely similar to a zip file with executables in it.
So is it something like Notepad++? You just take a bunch of files, keep it in a place, and it works, just like that?
So yeah, essentially, if you think of like a JRE, okay, Java runtime environment, okay, class files within the jar file that you're executing are just flat files. So there's an interpreter, the JRE, that takes those flat files and makes them do things. So you can take a container and think of it as a zip. You can think of it as just a thing holding files. And the interpreter that you use for that container is many different things. When people start talking about containers, the very first thing they talk about is Docker. Okay, Docker is the most common thing out there that you hear of, that you talk about when somebody says containers. So the way Docker works is, when you're working with containers, you start with a container image. Okay, and that container image contains a set of directions, or a set of directories with a set of files, And it has a thing that says, when I start up, I need to execute this script. So if your container is a Tomcat container, you're going to have a folder structure, something like opt Apache Tomcat 9. And your startup script when the container starts is going to be something like Tomcat 9/ben/startup.sh. Okay. Within that container, you're going to have definitions like I want Tomcat to start up listening on port 8080. I want it to bridge the network, so it's actually using the same NIC as the operating system, or I want it to be using a internal address that is not shared outside of the container situation. So you can have multiple services running within a single container that are all talking to each other, and then only Tomcat is allowed outside of the container world. Okay, so when we talk about a container runtime environment, we just discussed Docker. Okay, well, Kubernetes is also a container runtime environment, as is OpenShift. Okay, these are not the only three by any means, but they're the ones I bring up because Docker is the one everybody knows of when they start talking about containers. Okay, there was a release fairly recently, within the last year or so, that said that Kubernetes is going to drop support for, or drop Docker. And everybody that didn't know what that meant lost their marbles. Well, what it meant is that prior to that, Kubernetes was using Docker as its runtime environment for containers. But Docker, let's say, has a feature set of 30 features. Well, over the years, Kubernetes has built up its own feature set. So Kubernetes had 25 of those same 30 features that Docker was using. But they were still running Docker. So there was a lot of overhead running Docker as a runtime engine for the containers that was unnecessary because they had all the same capabilities inside Kubernetes. So what they changed was they changed the default runtime engine within Kubernetes from Docker to a runtime engine called Containerd, which stands for Container Daemon. And Container Daemon is just as compatible with the containers as Docker is, but it's more lightweight and it doesn't have as much heft to it. So when Kubernetes came out and said, we're dropping Docker, it's not, who cares? Are you still going to run containers? Yes. Are the containers still going to function properly? Yes. Do I, as an end user, care that you're running Containerd versus Docker? No. That's one of those under the hood things that really is largely unimportant for the most part.
So coming back to your zip file analogy, it doesn't care whether you use zip or you use gunzip, it'll still open up the file.
Exactly. If you're using 7-zip or RAR or gunzip or whatever, it's still a zip file, and you still have access to the contents of it because zip is a standardized format.
Okay.
Containers are standardized formats. So it doesn't matter what utility you're using to access the data within it.
That makes sense.
Okay. So I have microservices on here just to introduce the topic in case people aren't familiar with it. So back in the day, when applications started being built, you just had this homogeneous, monolithic piece that did everything. And what they found was that, when this one little piece broke, it caused the entire thing to break. So they started going down the road, and we're going, 10, 15 years back. They started going down the road of, well, let's actually break the web server out onto its own piece. And let's break the database server onto its own piece. And let's bring the app server into its own piece. And let's maybe even break the app server into 10 pieces so that each piece does its own little thing. So the idea of a microservice is just simply taking a functionality into its own containerized section so that it can be pulled out and replaced or multiplied individually. So instead of mid-tier being part of AR server, and you need you're overloading the Tomcat, instead of having to stand up 2 more AR servers in order to load your capacity, to increase your capacity horizontally, you actually just stand up another mid-tier, or 2 or 5, whatever you need to do. So mid-tier would be considered a microservice. So within the container world, the piece that you need right now is generally considered a microservice. So when you're standing up a container cluster, you're going to be putting together a whole bunch of microservices that all interact with each other in one way or another to produce the overall system that is, in this case, Remedy. So I've got it down here, but I'll talk about it up here. So when you're talking Kubernetes, you'll quite often see a term of K8S. That means Kubernetes. And the obvious question is, how the hell do you get from Kubernetes to K8S? So I actually asked the internet, how do you do that? So apparently the people that were working with Kubernetes said the name is too long. So they took the K and they replaced the 8 letters between the K and the S with the number 8, and they finished with an 8. So Kubernetes is, or K8S is literally K with 8 other letters and an S. And that's quite often when you're doing a research on the internet and somebody talks about K8S, it's exactly what it's talking about. So within Kubernetes, you've got a lot of stuff. I'm not even going to try to get into everything that's inside Kubernetes, but there's 2 main pieces to Kubernetes. There's the Kubernetes node and the Kubernetes pod. Okay. And a node is a machine that is part of the Kubernetes cluster. Now that machine could be a physical machine or a virtual machine, but it is a machine that's addressable by Kubernetes to run pods. What is a pod? A pod is just a grouping of 1 or potentially more containers that are part of a function, a service. So within Kubernetes, you're going to have your Kubernetes master node, and then you're going to have a couple of worker nodes. And if you're looking for high availability, you need at least 2 Kubernetes nodes to make sure that if node 1 goes down, node 2 can take over. But generally speaking, you're going to want 2, maybe 3 machines that Kubernetes can control and put pods in. So in this case, what the heck is a pod? Okay, well, the pods that we are going to have in a Remedy container cluster, those are going to be things like mid-tier, Smart IT, Remedy. These are all services that are going to be managed by Kubernetes. So we've got Kubernetes and OpenShift on here, and they're both separated by a slash. Okay, so what are Kubernetes and OpenShift? Why are they put together on this line? They're put together on the same line because they're both container orchestrators made by different companies. Kubernetes is a free open source container, originally, if I'm not mistaken, developed by Google, and eventually got open sourced and put out there as its own standalone product. OpenShift is a pay for capability container orchestrator. And in some ways, the old adage of you get what you pay for is true. With the pay for service of OpenShift, you have all sorts of capabilities via the GUI that you don't necessarily have in a Kubernetes situation. A lot of things in Kubernetes are command line based. So managing your Kubernetes cluster might require learning some new command lines and keeping a notepad of your favorite your favorite your favorite commands. But OpenShift has a little bit more of a GUI focus, and it from what I've heard, I have not personally experienced OpenShift, but from what I've heard, it's a little bit easier to manage an OpenShift cluster than it is to manage a Kubernetes cluster, just from a GUI perspective.
LJ, may I have a question? It's Mark.
Yes, sir.
I'm interested in the sentence you said. In one pod will be something like one application. So one pod will be smart IT, one pod will be AR system. Correct?
Yeah.
Pod is container, if I'm correct.
So pod does not equal container, because pod can contain more than one container, but generally contains a container. Yes.
Okay. So this means each application will be one container, if I'm correct. Did you mean this?
When you talk about an application, are you talking mid-tier would be a container?
For example, mid-tier, one container, smart IT,
Yep.
one container. It's like this?
Yep.
Okay.
There's a smart IT container, there's a mid-tier container, there's an AR server container.
Okay. So one container means one
container.
image. This is also correct.
Yes, a container. So a container is actually an implementation of the image.
Yes, I understand, but you need the image for container. So if you have different containers, you have to have different images. So each application will have extra image.
Yes.
Okay, this is important because till now I understood from every presentation that everything will be bundled in one image. Every applications, innovations, everything will be in one image, and you will have one container.
That was my understanding too, actually.
No, so the whole point of it. So just like you have your three mid-tier servers, if you take out the OS for those mid-tier servers, and each mid-tier is a container, you're going to have 3 pods that are running mid-tier, running in your Kubernetes cluster.
Yes, that I'm okay with this new understanding, because I was afraid it is like that everything will be in one container. It crashes, everything fast. Yeah, so it is better that each application will have separate image. So this means separate container, which when it crash, then I will have running the rest. Yeah, so I'm happy that it's like this. And by the way, question: do you know already how the Tomcat will be handled? Will this be content of the containers? Will it be delivered with from BMC or
It's part of the container. Yep, the Tomcat that's running mid-tier is part of the container.
Okay, so there will be always some version, and if there will be some security issue, then we will get new container with new Tomcat.
Now that's a piece that I cannot directly speak to as far as how that works.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But I do know that yes, the Tomcat is part of the container. So each container is self-contained.
Okay.
So in the case of I need to run mid-tier, well, I need to run mid-tier on something, because mid-tier is just a JSP application. So it needs to be bundled with a Tomcat. So in situations like DoD, where they have the requirement that says I need to be running. I've worked in some DoD environments where they give them 2 weeks from the day that that the latest patch or the latest version is released. They have 2 weeks to be on that patch, because upon that version release, they have listed, here are all the defects that we fixed from the previous version. Well, the DoD says we can't have known unpatched vulnerabilities. So because version 2 was just released, we know about these vulnerabilities and there is a patch available to fix them. So you must roll out your Tomcat with the updated, with the updated version within 2 weeks of its availability, which is a royal pain in the butt when you start talking about Java and Tomcat and all that sort of stuff. So I've worked in those environments, so I do not know how BMC is planning on handling that scenario. Because historically speaking, BMC releases, 2 or 3 version old Tomcats. I mean, you know, I forget when they moved from Tomcat 7 to Tomcat 8, but the history of the availability of getting a newer Tomcat out of BMC has not been stellar. Okay, so in those situations where BMC is saying, you will run this container, and this is mid-tier, I don't know how they plan on handling that sort of scenario.
Okay, but I'm happy for the bots. Okay, thank you.
And
Okay.
LJ, I think we talked at some point about, for instance, the plugins and stuff like this, and that would be a special container for the plugins to the Remedy server, right?
Yeah, so when we talk about plugins from a SaaS perspective, and we'll get into what is a container and what is not a container as far as requirements and limitations and such here in a minute. But within the environment of Kubernetes, it is arguably safe to say that file systems are not permanent. Okay, so the way that you specify a plugin to run on your environment doesn't work in a container world, because what you have to do is you have to stand up your AR server, and then you have to modify your plugin server config.xml, and then you have to deploy some files onto your file system and restart the plugin server. And when the plugin server starts, it says, "Oh, I need to load this plugin." Well, in the Kubernetes container world, you can't make changes to that file system object. And you can't store those plugin files on the server. So how do you stand up that plugin then? And the way that it's handled in the SaaS environment is what they've done is they've done what's called a sidecar container, which is a separate container running within the same cluster. And that separate container is the plugin, a standalone plugin server that is pre-configured with that plugin. And then when you upgrade the Remedy server or you reboot the Remedy server or whatever, that doesn't affect that the fact that you've got this other container sitting off to the side that's a custom container that is the plugin server and your plugin itself. And when that container starts up, it says, "Hey, AR server, I'm registering." And the AR server says, "Awesome, cool, welcome to the pool, hop on in." And AR server can now talk to that plugin server because it's a plugin server in the traditional sense, but it's not part of the AR server container. So you're able to run sidecar containers in that way.
LJ, let me ask a question here. What I thought I heard you say there is, let's pretend I have 5 plugins that I like using. Does that mean there's going to be 5 plugin sidecars, one for each one, or are all of them going to be in one sidecar?
Well, I do not know exactly how BMC is intending to roll this out, but because of the fact that I've been involved a little bit in some of these sidecar situations, because of the RESTful plugin that I wrote, basically what they do is they build a container for my sidecar and stand that sidecar up in any environment that needs it. Okay. In your situation, let's say you have 5 plugins that you need to run. What you might do, and I'm theorizing, I do not know the official BMC standpoint on this, but what you might end up doing is you might build a custom container with all 5 plugins that run on that plugin server and attach that one sidecar container to your Remedy instances, and your Remedy instances are now using it. Okay. So instead of 5 separate, I mean, you could build 5 separate ones if you wanted to, or you could build one.
Right.
That allows you to do what you want. Now, I've got another reference here, YAML. I was introduced to YAML probably 18, 20 years ago. And I was like, what the heck is that? I'm familiar with XML. I'm familiar with HTML. What is YAML? YAML literally stands for yet another markup language. It was built and designed as a very easy configuration file. And I bring it up as a term for anybody that's not already familiar with YAML, because YAML is used as a configuration file style in just about every component that is used in containers. So when you're talking about a YAML file, if you're talking a Docker file, there's an object called Docker file that defines what is in a container when you're defining a container. It is in YAML format. When you're talking about Kubernetes configuration, it's in YAML format. Okay, so you'll quickly become aware of what is YAML format, and you'll quickly become familiar with just the basics of YAML as you start working with a containerized environment, because it's everywhere. So I wanted to bring that up as a term to become familiar with. So I touched on a minute ago that containers are considered read-only, that they don't have file systems. And this leads to a lot of confusion because it is both true and not true. So just like a zip file, you don't modify the zip file because that's the image. Okay, you don't modify the zip file. So when you're wanting to use what's in the zip, you extract the zip out to a place so that you can use what's in it. And you can modify what's in that extracted folder. You can add things to it, you can move things to it, and that never touches the zip file itself. So containers are similar to that in that you can instantiate a container, and you can go into that container and you can edit the config files, you can do whatever it is you need to do, and that container will retain all the changes that you save. And if you go to your container instantiator in Docker, Kubernetes, whatever, and you say, start up another one of those, it will have its own separate file system that you can modify. And you can stop it and start it again, and it'll still have all the changes that you made in it. So from that perspective, it's not read-only. It's not a read-only file system. But when you enter into a Kubernetes world, things get a little interesting. So one of the things that you do in Kubernetes is you say, okay, so we've talked about the fact that I need 3 mid-tiers. So in a Kubernetes config file, you say, here is my image. It is a mid-tier image. I want you to instantiate 3 of those, please. Kubernetes launches 3 pods with mid-tier configs in them. If one of those mid-tiers crashes because it has an out of memory or something causes it to become unresponsive, what Kubernetes does is it destroys that pod, throws it away, and stands up a new one. If you change your config to say, I need not 3, but 5 of them, it'll spin up 2 more pods. And then if you later decide, nah, I only wanted 4, it destroys one of the pods and throws it away. If one crashes, it throws it away and starts up a new one. So while a single container is not read-only, you can do things at the container level. When you reach the orchestration level, the orchestration level doesn't care about any individual container. All it cares about is how many of them does it need, and is this one up or down? And if it's down, it destroys it and brings a new one up. So the file system within a given container is not read-only, but you can think of it as being stored in a temp place. So that you
Question. So you said it when it goes down, it automatically brings it up. Is the failure recorded somewhere? Why it went down in the first place before it?
It's recorded in the Kubernetes logs that says this node went down and I started up a new one.
So what are the chances like you might get into a a loop with some sort of a problem with what, depending on whatever the problem was?
Well, that's kind of one of the beauties of Kubernetes containers, because have you ever walked out to you go to a training ground, okay? A training system, and you're working on the system, and you walk in the next day and they said, everything you did to the system last night is gone, because we did we took a snapshot before you got here. Whatever you did, we rolled the snapshot back, and you're back to a clean system. So no matter what you did to the system to screw it up yesterday, you're back to gold. So by constantly throwing away the changes to an environment and bringing them back in, you're brought back to a gold configuration. Okay, so there's nothing in that container that failed that could cause the next container that comes up to cause the same failure.
Okay, all right.
So you're not likely to get yourself into a situation where the container crashes and comes back up and crashes again and comes back up, unless there's something else going on.
So you won't get into an infinite loop kind of a situation.
Not likely. I don't know Kubernetes yet well enough to know that if there's a number of retries, or I don't know. I'm sure that there are configurations in there that say, if you tried to start a pod 10 times and it failed within 30 seconds of starting it, then don't start it again. I don't know. I'm not sure about that type of configuration. That sort of infinite loop situation. But ideally, you're not going to find yourself in that scenario, that the image itself, because the container doesn't get corrupted.
Mm-hmm.
The runtime of the container might get corrupted in some fashion, but the image does not. So you're not likely to get into a situation unless you have a bad image in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, in the remedy world that we know, most of the stuff is in the database, or everything will be in the database, I guess. And so if the database fails, and the database is not part of this container system, this is still the database that you connect to.
And that brings us to another point regarding the file system of containers. So containers are self-contained little fenced-in areas of code that are not supposed to have their own permanent storage. Now, there are configurations that you can give to containers that say, every time you start up, I want you to map this folder to this external storage point, and I want to reference those configuration files. That is a possibility. But in general, a container is thought to be largely stateless, in that you could destroy it and bring up a new one and be in the same state you were before you destroyed it and brought up a new one. Okay, which brings us a lot to the, if we all remember central config coming onto the plane several years back, it's like, well, why are they storing everything that's in the AR config in the database? And why are they storing everything that's in the plugin server config in the database? That was all decisions that were leading to today of being able to instantiate a mid-tier and not worry about what files are on the file system, because all the configuration of that mid-tier is stored in the database. All the configuration of the data of the AR server is stored in the database. So there's nothing stored on the file system that's important from a if it gets wiped out, I've lost everything perspective. So because of the fact that containers are supposed to be quasi-stateless from that perspective, you can run databases in containers if you want to. But the general concept within the industry is that things that require permanent storage aren't in containers. So in this scenario, you have your SQL server, your Oracle server, or your Postgres server. You've got that sitting wherever the heck you've got that sitting, either on a physical or a virtual machine somewhere. And it's got its network attached storage. It's got its entire configuration. And the remedy containers are reaching out of the remedy, out of the Kubernetes cluster, and talking to that database. So thank you for bringing that up, Vichy.
So how long does it container take to come up? Is it the time taken by the service, whatever it is, like the mid-tier or whatever, plus the time the container
Yeah,
takes?
whatever's in it. Yeah.
Plus the
I
time
was
the
talking
container.
to.
So how long does the container itself take to come out? Like, forget about what's in it.
Less than a second.
Less than, okay, all right. So like it's
So
just
so it's part of the instantiation. So how long does it take your machine to post?
like
What? The very first thing that happens when you boot your computer is your BIOS posts.
Mhm.
And then it starts reading its peripherals, it figures out its configuration, and it starts booting the operating system. Think of it similarly. So when the container engine says start, the container is already instantiated. The container already exists. It's just the container runtime environment that's coming in and saying, kick off your script. Now, in the case of mid-tier, how long does it take Tomcat to come up? Well, if it's mid-tier, it takes, 30 seconds to a minute. If it's Smart IT, Tomcat takes, in upwards of a minute to 2 to come up. If it's ITSM, AR server, it can take anywhere from a minute to half an hour. But the container itself is there from the moment that the container engine says start.
I just asked you to explain how the networking component of this works, because I'm kind of not following how you had the example of multiple mid-tier pods, I think you called them.
Yep.
Are they coming up at different IPs as in present day multiple mid-tier servers would, or are they all sharing the one IP and one pod takes some of the incoming traffic, another pod takes some of the other, and then?
So that's a very good question that requires a lot more in-depth knowledge of exactly how it works than I have, but I can give you the broad strokes. So the network inside of a Kubernetes cluster is an internal network. Okay. In order for you to access anything inside the Kubernetes cluster, you have to explicitly tell Kubernetes, I want this pod exposed. And here's the IP I want to give that pod. Okay. So you organize pods within a Kubernetes cluster in what are called services. So we'll just call it the mid-tier service. So you tell Kubernetes, I need 3 pods of mid-tier and attach them all to this service. So all 3 of those are started up in that service. And then let's say I need 2 AR servers. We'll call this the remedy service. And it starts up 2 AR server pods, and those are part of the remedy service. And then you tell mid-tier, I need you to connect to the AR service, or to the remedy service. Kubernetes does that. You don't need to know the IP address of the remedy servers, because the remedy server IP can change from 1 second to another, whether you're standing up a 3rd node or the 2nd node is crashing and it's restanding up a 2nd node. The 2nd node standing up is not going to come up with the same IP address or even MAC address as the node that just crashed. Nor do you care. And I know that that's scary, because when I was learning about this, I was like, how in the heck am I supposed to access my systems? Okay. So that's where Ingress comes in. Okay. So, well, actually, it doesn't even come in that situation. So in the situation of mid-tier talking to AR server, that's one service talking to another service. Kubernetes handles all the load balancing internally. So when we come into the question of how do I access my AR server with Dev Studio? Okay. The way you do that is you define the admin AR server pod to define an external IP. And your Dev Studio connects to that external IP that you configured, and you're talking directly to the admin pod. But if you need to talk to your user-facing remedy servers, you define what's called an ingress controller. Okay, and an ingress controller is similar to a service at the Kubernetes level, but it's for external communication. So you define an ingress controller and say, this ingress controller is connected to this service. And then you just talk to the ingress controller, and it handles all the load balancing as to which node you're talking to. Because like I said, Kubernetes could destroy this node and bring up a new one, and destroy this one and bring up a new one. So you don't care about IPs that you don't necessarily even care what IP you're talking to. All you care about is what service you're talking to. It's an abstraction layer.
Sure.
So services within Kubernetes can talk to each other without really much configuration other than specifying what service a pod is associated with. You just point your mid-tier at your AR server service, your remedy service, and it talks to it. And then you define a ingress controller for your mid-tiers, and it controls which mid-tier you're talking to. You don't have to care.
So
Now, if you
so
do
mid-tiers-
need, go ahead, sorry.
You seem to be going there yourself. Go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, if you do need to talk to an individual mid-tier as opposed to the cluster, you can configure that pod to have an external IP. But if you don't need that capability, you don't have to configure it, and you don't have to worry about how to get to the individual node.
And are these instances of, let's say, mid-tier or ARS indistinguishable from one another? Or like, are they coming from the vendor? Is BMC going to give us, here's the latest, ARS container, just you go and instantiate it?
Now, when you're talking about ARS, you're dealing a little bit more difficult world, because you're talking at that point, database structure that needs to be maintained. How do I upgrade from ARS 9.1 to 9.104? There's database structure that has to be upgraded and all that sort of stuff. And so that's a little bit different.
Let's say a patch where a patch where historically it would have been given to us as a file, replace this file on the file system.
Yeah, so what's going to happen is BMC is going to provide you a new container, and you're going to go into Kubernetes and say, I need 3 of this container, please. And it's going to boot those up, and then you can say, okay, go ahead and shut down those 3 of the old container. And you're upgraded. You're patched.
This is the new definition for this service. These.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
Yep. So there's no installing file systems and copying jar files from location 1 to location 2. There's none of that. They handed you a new zip file, and you hand that zip file to the orchestrator and say, I need you to run this zip file instead of that zip file.
So what you're saying is, if BMC is controlling, say, the Tomcat, and your version or 2 back, and DoD says, hey, we need to get this fixed, they give you a new one, you just de-instantiate the old containers and instantiate the new ones, and you're patched. You didn't do a patch, you just replaced.
Yep. And that's part of what Darius is going to be talking to at VRUG, with what are the advantages to containers over the legacy file system install. And that's one of them, because upgrading, it went, I'd say about 3-4 months ago, I got myself a Synology NAS, and I had half a dozen services that I had installed on one of my machines, and all these services were available via container. So Synology can run Docker, and I started playing with containers because I had no functional, what the heck is a container? Conceptually I knew what they were, but I had no functional knowledge of what the containers were. So I started playing with my Synology, and it was fun. I went into Docker and I said, download this image, start up this image, run it on this port, go. All of a sudden that app was just up. And then 3 months later, when that application gets patched, I download the new container, I stop the old one, I start the new one, and in my containers, I've got external config that I've got, I set up a mount point on the container configuration saying mount this folder to this place. So my config is actually stored outside of the container on the file system on my NAS. And when I stop the old container, delete it, I download the image, I start the new container, start it up, it reads the config, and I'm upgraded. It used to be I had to, shut it down and copy files over and make backups of my, config files and put them in the new place and reconfigure my my service or whatever that was running it. So theoretically, it is as simple as shut down the old container, start up the new container. Now, obviously, there's lots of complexities associated with that. And that's where we get into this piece here. Okay, this piece is the deployment engine. So it is the question of how does one get this stuff to the things that need it? Okay, so another technology that some of us may or may not have had any experience with is called Jenkins. By a show of hands or voices, who has any experience with Jenkins at all?
Spell it out, so obviously not.
Chirp, chirp, yes. Okay, so Jenkins is a source automation tool. What the hell does that mean? Okay, what that means is that it takes a source control repository, in this case, Git. Okay, everybody's heard of Git. If they have no experience with Git, they've at least heard of Git. Okay, so what BMC is going to do is they are providing a Git repository delivery system. Okay, so you're going to get all of your images from BMC out of a repository. And when new patches are issued, they're just going to dump them in the repository, and it's up to you if you want to go consume them or not. Okay, and in this repository, they've got a bunch of Ansible scripts. Is anybody familiar with Ansible? Okay, think of Ansible as a batch file on steroids that has not only the ability to do a whole lot more than, say, a batch file or a PowerShell can do, but it has the ability to execute commands on remote machines. So it has full control via your authentication to do anything on any machine that you tell it to.
Right.
Okay. So what happens is BMC develops a Git repository, and this Git repository has a series of pipelines in it. Okay, and a pipeline is I'm going to screw up the term, a Jenkins script. Okay, a pipeline says, look in this directory for what I need. And that directory is going to contain a series of Ansible scripts that are going to define how to deploy your architecture. Some of the questions it's going to ask are things like, what is your Kubernetes cluster what are you wanting the, what database is this AR server going to connect to? What's its username and what's its password? Basically, all the things that you would normally answer during a Remedy install are going to be part of a Jenkins pipeline parameter list. So you're going to go into Jenkins, you're going to set up your pipelines after you download your repositories from BMC. And you're going to set up your pipelines and you're going to say, build with parameters. Build with parameters are going to pop up a screen in front of you that says 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and there's 50 questions you've got to answer to get this deployed. And you say, go, or the button is build. And all these Ansible scripts are going to essentially communicate with your Kubernetes cluster. They're going to tell Kubernetes, hey, we're calling this service X. Here is the image on how to execute it. Okay, that's AR server. Now we've got mid-tier. Now we've got Smart IT. Now we've got Smart Reporting. Now we've got so on and so forth. And the script just gives it everything it needs, and it's doing all the file copying necessary. It's doing all the configuration necessary. It all gets updated into Kubernetes. And when the script says, I'm done, your Kubernetes cluster is now populated with all the images that came out of Jenkins and the Git repository. And your AR server is up and running.
So it's sort of a silent install.
Essentially.
Yep.
So that is like the BMC solution for basically on-prem for customizing is using the Jenkins. That's what they're currently going with. Is that correct?
That's the deployment possibility.
Yeah. Okay.
And when you get a new build, say you're like this patch that was being discussed earlier, that's going to be a Jenkins repository. So you're going to, a Git repository. So you're going to get that repository downloaded into your Jenkins, and you're going to highlight that repository, and you're going to say, build with parameters. And it's going to say, where am I putting this? What am I doing with it? And you give it the information it asks for, and you hit build, and it talks to Kubernetes, and it does what's necessary.
And do you reckon that BMC's direction is that updates that are involved code as well would be delivered that way? ARX, what would have been done as def files, let's say?
Well, if you're of a sufficient version right now, you know that the package deployer, D2P, dev to prod, you're familiar with that at all? Yep. Okay. So dev to prod, D2P packages work very similarly to this. You just log into mid-tier and load the D2P package and hit deploy, and it notifies all the plugins that were built to do all the file system copies and all that sort of stuff. So you can anticipate that something similar to that will probably be done. I can't guarantee you that that's how a code patch will be deployed, but I imagine that it's going to be a Jenkins pipeline. And I know for right now in 2105, the only way to get to 2105 is either a clean install or from a 2020 install. So you have to be running 2002. 2002, sorry. Yeah, I said 2020, sorry. You have to be running a 2002 install. And then when you are doing your upgrade, there's a special Jenkins pipeline that gets executed. And that Jenkins pipeline is essentially the upgrade DB script that the installer would have done to upgrade you from version X to version Y. That Jenkins package contains all the stuff necessary to modify the database from a 2002 configuration to a 2105 configuration. And they've said that they've said that the intent is to increase the backwards compatibility of that upgrade, but from an initial release, you have to be on 2002. So if you're currently on 1902 or 1908, there's a possibility that you could go to not 2105, but maybe 22.1 from 1908 when that comes out, because they've stated that they're wanting to increase the backwards compatibility from an upgrade perspective. But from that perspective, knowing that that exists, and that is just upgrade the database, I expect that they're going to be deploying application upgrades via Jenkins pipelines.
I assume that's kind of the same thing, that they'd be running like an intermediate container to do the DB upgrade before it runs the final deploy. Yeah.
Essentially, yeah.
So LJ, kind of taking a little different tact on things with this, I think one of the areas that I'm really struggling with and struggling to help customers and stuff that way with is what kind of infrastructure to set up with Kubernetes, et cetera, to support this. So do you have any experience? Obviously the BMC containers aren't available yet, and everybody's launching at the bit to get a hold of one of those to start playing. But where can people start looking to, if I wanted to stand up a dev instance on my own local laptop or anything, is that even a capability? I got Docker and everything installed on my laptop. Could I possibly run a BMC container in there, or am I, do I need to look at an AWS instance or something to play around, or just play? I mean, looking into this, there's quite a few options. You can stand up a bunch of VMs to set up a Kubernetes cluster. You can do it on hard metal. So that's where we're looking for guidance. People are wanting to be ready when BMC is ready, but it's hard because there's so many options. It's almost like BMC is not really giving that guidance or options that way. So I think that's where everybody's kind of, at least in my world, that's where people are struggling to, hey, how do I get ready? Not just get it spun up on what a container is, but hey, I've got to build out this Kubernetes infrastructure, right? So any thoughts there?
So I can't give any official guidance because I'm certainly not on the selection team of providing that guidance. I've received some internal notifications about the size of what it takes in order to stand up a full everything. And the numbers are honestly a little staggering at times when, we've all been, if you've been in Remedy long enough, I have 3 Remedy servers sitting on a VM on my personal desktop here. One on Windows, one on Linux, and one on Linux running Oracle, but there are Kubernetes Lite instances that allow you to run Kubernetes. I can't think of the name of the tool, but there's Kubernetes in general.
It's Minikube.
Minikube. Thank you.
Yep.
Minikube is the one I was looking for. So Minikube is a Kubernetes architecture that is designed to run on your laptop instead of on a server with 3 nodes and so on and so forth. So from that perspective, maybe. Obviously, when you're dealing with I'm just looking for a dev box on my laptop, you don't need the 3 nodes of mid-tier. You don't need all that stuff, and you don't need all the overhead associated with a full Kubernetes install, which is why Minikube was produced so that you could run Kubernetes on a local perspective. Obviously, I've been asked by numerous people to go to. I forget who asked the question earlier about like if you needed to upgrade the Tomcat. Obviously, containers are like zip files from the perspective that you can open up an existing container and you can modify that container in a way that makes sense for you. And then you can save a new container that is a snapshot of the updated container. And then you can deploy that container instead of the original container. So if the original container contained Tomcat 9 and you need to be running Tomcat 9.5, you could take the Tomcat 9 container, you could modify it to run Tomcat 9.5, and then replace the Tomcat 9 container to run what you need to run.
Do you mean images, not containers now? Probably.
Sorry, image. Yes, you can take the. Yes, I apologize. I'm mixing terms, and that's a horrible thing to do. You can take the.
Yes,
that's
okay.
You can take the Tomcat 9 image, modify it appropriately to what you need, and then use the new image to instantiate containers. It's been suggested by various people I've talked to. Well, I could just do that with a remedy server. I could take the BMC container that is provided by BMC, and I could modify that plugin server config, and I could add those files that I need to run my extra plugins. I could create a new image, and then I could run that image instead of the one that BMC provides me.
Yes, the problem is only that the image from BMC is still not provided, you know. My environment is ready and hot, but I still don't have the image.
Right. Well, the question ultimately arises from that discussion of, could I do that? And the answer is yes. But the question then arises, is that supported? And I dare say the answer is probably no.
Well, so kind of going back to the infrastructure question too, I'm seeing multiple ways that, you know, I can build out a Kubernetes cluster, right? So
yep.
And basically what I'm hearing from you is it doesn't really matter what way I build out the cluster, as long as it's got the resources needed in order to support that. And I can, you know, obviously talk to the repository and do all of that kind of stuff. But really that cluster side of it, that's not where BMC doesn't want to be involved in that side of things, because that's up to you and your architecture and your what you can stand up from a hardware perspective, et cetera. They're not going to give you recommendations or decisions there. But I think a lot of customers are looking for that because it's kind of newer to them, you know. But I'm treating it just like VMware, right? That's not something BMC doesn't tell you, hey, this is how big your VMware environment has to be or anything like that. They just say stand up some VMs. So at the same time, they're saying you need to have this amount of resources in order to support our containers, and then they leave you to define what your cluster is going to look like. Kind of up to you, right?
Yeah, and basically the numbers that I've heard are simply coming from the idea of, okay, so what are we going to consider a standard deploy? Okay, I'm making all of these numbers up entirely off the top of my head. I'm going to need 3 mid-tiers. I'm going to need 2 AR servers. I'm going to need 2 smart IT servers. I'm going to need a smart reporting server. And I take a look at my existing docs of how much resources am I asking for each mid-tier. Multiply that by 3. How many resources am I asking for AR server? Multiply that by 2. How much resources am I asking for all of these various components? Multiply it by the number of nodes, add it all together, and say, here is my recommendation for how many CPUs you need in your Kubernetes cluster and how much memory you need in your Kubernetes cluster.
Yeah. So I've heard a couple of people sound like they've got their architecture already. Anybody want to share what they're currently doing? Are you doing it on VMs? Are you doing it on bare metal? Do you have architecture up in the cloud somewhere you're planning on using? What are you guys? I mean, that kind of defeats the on-prem purpose, but does anybody want to share what they're currently doing, what they're planning to do?
Hey, Cade, I'll tell you what I can do. I will see if I can share this. So here's what we're doing. If I can share, hang on a second, LJ. By the way, LJ, thank you for staying on. I'm trying to keep this going because there's a lot of information that you're presenting. So I'm going to share with you what we have. So we actually spun up a Proxmox server. We're using Proxmox. So Proxmox will run containers, LXC containers. It'll also run VMs. So this is a Proxmox server that we have. It's got, I think, 24 cores. It's got 192 gig of RAM. Right now we're running a VPN server, we're running an Apache Tomcat container. These are containers. We're running a VPN server in a container, we're running an Apache Tomcat container, we're running a Postgres container. And then down here in the VMs, we've got an old 8.1 VM, and then a CentOS VM.
Hey, Phil, if you're sharing, you're not actually sharing.
Oh, sorry.
Or if you think you're sharing.
Okay, sorry, thank you.
I stopped sharing so that you could, but you didn't start.
Okay. So I apologize. Thank you for, sorry. So this is our, thank you, Kate. We have a Proxmox server, and the Proxmox server can spin up containers. It can spin up VMs. So these are a bunch of the VMs we've got. We've got some Windows 10, 2008. Jason's got a Docker machine. These are VMs, but this can also, we've also got a Postgres container. We've got a Tomcat container. We've got here's our open VPN server so we can get to it. This is the machine that we have. It's sitting in a server room over here. It's, like I said, it's a dual Xeon 24 core machine.
Phil,
so
I think
that's what
Cade,
we're using to play around with.
Yeah, I think Cade meant that if people have planned out for their real systems, not our play systems on the side for it. But
Right.
yeah,
Well, and LJ's been talking about some of the numbers, and we've had some discussion with BMC, and yeah, the specs are very large. So
Yeah,
I don't know how we're gonna all do
I've
it.
seen that as well. I mean, so I mean, just kind of looking at VMs, they're kind of telling us that a lot of these nodes, et cetera, need to be at least 16 CPU with 64 gigs of RAM, and you're having multiple nodes in that in your VMs and stuff that way, which, you know, if you start building that out in a virtual VM environment, that's starting to become a fairly big VMware infrastructure, right, just to support the Remedy stuff. But yeah, I've seen people build VMs with Linux, and then they're putting Kubernetes on top of that. It also looks like VMware itself has a Kubernetes instance that can run inside of VMware. I don't know what the licensing, et cetera, is around that. There's so many options out there. It's kind of daunting to say what is the best option to be able to install, you know, remedies from a container. And I don't know the BMC is going to make a recommendation, because
I was talking with a colleague recently about, you know, exactly this topic. And I said, the node that Kubernetes is running on could be either bare metal or virtual. And he said, why in the world would you create a virtual machine to run a Kubernetes node on? And I said, why would you partition a bare metal machine into 3 different virtual machines to run 2 different Remedy servers on? Because you need some, you know, you need some layer at some point to run something. So whether it's bare metal or if it's VMs, and you decide to allocate, you know, 3 hefty VMs from 3 separate bare metals, and call those your three Kubernetes nodes, cool. If you decide to allocate 2 bare metal machines as Kubernetes nodes, okay. And you are very correct, and I've talked to my management about that exact subject of, and as you said, BMC doesn't seem interested in telling you how to set up your Kubernetes. They just want you to do it and make it available so that Remedy can use it. I've talked to them about that, and it creates a problem similar to what we had with Mongo many years ago. Those of you who forayed into the smart IT world when Mongo was the database of smart IT, BMC said, here, run this installer, go. And all the BMC customers said, okay. And they ran out and they ran the installers, and smart IT worked just fine. And then 2 years later, smart IT is not performing as well as it's supposed to. So we start doing diagnostics to find out why it's not running properly. Well, nobody's maintaining their MongoDBs. So we ask them, well, what's your MongoDBA say? And they say, what MongoDBA? We don't have a MongoDBA. You told us to install Mongo. Why would I have my own DBA for that? That's your database.
Well, and that's exactly kind of where we're getting with this is, you know, you almost need a Kubernetes expert in order to maintain the Kubernetes infrastructure, right? I mean, not necessarily to get the cloud and stuff that way, but just like in majority of the environments I go into, I'm not the VMware administrator managing, you know, I can go request VMs and stuff that way, and they might give me a little bit of access to take snapshots or do whatever I need to there, but somebody else is generally in charge of setting up that infrastructure. And I'm seeing kind of the same thing here with this, but a lot of organizations haven't quite made that jump into the true cloud environment where they can support the containers. So they're looking for that guidance, and so I've got VMware guys that are saying, well, what do you want me to do? And trying to figure out guidance there. And that's even some high level guidance of what best, options are, I think would be beneficial or helpful. And that's
I think what BMC is going to be able to provide is not how to set up your Kubernetes cluster, but they're going to be able to say, here's how many Kubernetes nodes we recommend you have, and here's the capacity of each of those nodes that we recommend.
Gotcha.
And it'll be up to you at that point to say, okay, yes, I need 2 VMs with, as you said, 64 gigs of RAM and 24 CPUs, or whatever the recommendations are from BMC. But I personally am working toward becoming Kubernetes certified, because you and everybody else that we're pushing down this particular road is going to need a lot of help in that Kubernetes cluster management space, because you don't have a Kubernetes admin on staff. So you're going to need that help. So BMC is investing internally because it understands that, and it's going to be trying to provide you as much assistance in configuring it as possible. But BMC's stance appears to be, and I'm not speaking for BMC or putting words in their mouth, but BMC's stance appears to be similar to that of the DBA. We require a database. We require that database to function. It's up to you to have an admin on staff that is properly trained in how to manage that database to get the most out of it.
Ding, 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 ding.
Yeah, that's how I'm seeing it. For
that is absolutely 1,022% correct.
Well, it's just like VMware and all of the other infrastructure, right? BMC doesn't take responsibility. You might provide a little bit of tuning guidance for your stuff to run correctly, but the overarching architecture is the responsibility of the organization. And that, I think that's been one of the biggest hurdles for me to overcome is, hey, you're not going to tell me how to set up Kubernetes. So one other quick question, then I'll shut up for a little bit. But so Phil was showing another container type deployment capability or manager other than Kubernetes. BMC is making a recommendation to go down with the Kubernetes route, but that's not to say that because Docker is a fairly open source, open methodology to be able to create these containers. I'm assuming we can go down the other route. They just may not be as supported as what BMC's doing, or deploying these containers in other things other than Kubernetes, or managing them with stuff other than Kubernetes. Have you heard anything on that?
Who are you asking me, or are you just putting
whoever wants to respond?
There is a requirements URL. There's a requirements site that has been published listing the different components that are expected to be in place to support the on-prem containerized environment. The expectation is that customers will be aligning to those versions of those components, and Kubernetes is one of those core ones where statements have been made from one of the key people who are kind of managing our strategy around containers, that, for example, the expectation is that for 2105, you have to be using Kubernetes 1.18. Although Kubernetes 1.18 is about to go out of support at some point in the near future, and Kubernetes 1.20 is the latest and greatest coming on the horizon. For 2105, we're only supporting we're only supporting
1.18.
Yeah, exactly. So let me say this in passing the ball up here, and I wish I could come in and just I had to step away and just came back to the tail end of the conversation. But let me put something out here. And Phil and others have known me for a while, so I'll probably be saying some stuff that I probably shouldn't be saying, but who cares?
That's why we love you, Darius.
In that there are 3 perspectives to look at for customers that there is. I'm saying this from the services side that we're planning for. there are those folks and customers out there that cannot spell containers if their life depended on it. And to that audience, we have, you look at professional services and consulting and offerings that we're trying to put together to enable our customer base. We're not trying to touch them with a 10-foot pole. We're trying to redirect them to managed services. So we're trying to direct them to people who are familiar with, understand, and have the expertise. To exactly the point that that was being made earlier, which is, it's like the database. The expectation is that this is the environment that is to be owned and managed by the customer. And to that end, if you don't have that expertise in place, it is not the expectation for BMC to deploy this in such a way that you don't need to do the care and feeding around this. It is expected that will be there. Part one, group number one. Group number, at the other extreme of the pendulum, and I've worked with these customers, they've been on the container channel for a while now. They've been doing it with other products. They actually have a organization that is establishing the container strategy or establishing the container standards for their company. So they're coming to
exactly
BMC,
like the VM teams.
Exactly. And they're coming to BMC saying, it's about time you guys caught up and got this container. What we need is two things from you. We need your definition and your reference architecture document, and we need your sizing considerations, and we'll take it from there. I don't even want to talk to you guys anymore. Just give us those two things, we're good to go, okay? And then there's that bucket in between where there are folks who are familiar with or even have developed subject matter expertise around containers, but they're not a part of an organization or a standard or a structure that is in place to establish that standard, but they have the knowledge around what containers are. And what they're looking for is guidance, which I think is a large part of this conversation, around, okay, we know these are the basics. Here's the reference architecture. Here's the sizing. But give us some guidance, knowing good and full well that I am running a mid-sized service management ITSM deployment with DWP, chatbot, and some other components. Give me some guidance to work with me to figure out what's the best capability there. BMC in that regard is trying to work to set up offerings from services to provide that support to enable, to support the customers who have those resources to become sufficient relative to our product. So there's the, I don't know how to spell containers on one end. There's the, I'm the one who actually gave the suggestion on how to spell containers on the other extreme. And then there's the people that are, the folks that are in the middle, which we're trying to enable and support through professional services or offerings along those lines, as well as documentation. The final point I'll make, please understand, to the questions and points that you guys are making, you are spot on. We flat out need to do more. We flat out need to do more. We are frankly behind the curve as far as getting you information that you need, but also acknowledge the fact that frankly, this container, we're new into this game. We're on that front end of the game, and we are trying to get information out in the channels that we can. So I would encourage you to please be specific and keep beating the drum and banging on the desk to get the stuff that you are absolutely entitled to and should be getting, because we should have this stuff at this point published on a website with this kind of documentation. We frankly should have training that you can attend specific to our solution so that you can basically take a web class online to get this information in a channel. But we are so furiously focused on getting the tuning of the solution and the container footprint down because, as pointed out, if you just take what we tell you now, it is daunting how big that container footprint is being asked for. And we're trying to figure out how to get tuning and other elements in place to get that footprint down. And that's where really a lot of the energy is going. And unfortunately, not to the degree of providing the content as if we have it all figured out so we can give you those answers sooner than later. So that's just being completely transparent about this. I'm sorry I haven't answered the questions in a way that says, ta-da, go here and you get all your answers solved. But I just wanted to paint the picture of the reality of the situation.
So one last kind of question related to that then. So let's assume that we've got somebody in that scenario where they are totally comfortable with containers, but they've built out an environment that's not Kubernetes, you know, so like Phil was showing another solution there. I mean, it's tough to to go to somebody that's already got something that they think's working for them and tell them they have to deploy something totally new. So, I mean, is there minimal support for that? Or
Well,
not that I've run into that scenario yet, but I'm just,
we're running into that scenario now, because let's go to that last bucket of folks, the people who are establishing the standards for the entire enterprise about how containers will be will be deployed and managed
Right.
within companies. And heaven forbid they pick a standard that doesn't include, you know, our narrow selected, you must have Kubernetes 1.18 in place.
right.
Heaven forbid they do something other than that because, oh, I don't know, they decided to go to 1.20 because that's where the latest release is and they're trying to stay current. And we're saying, we don't support that. What we're saying, in that case, what they're saying and emphasizing is we are testing in our labs against 1.18. We have not gotten to the point of all these different permutations of other things out there to be able to say that we are certified against these other options, even if we stay within Kubernetes and go to 1.20. We haven't, it should work, right? I mean, it should, but we haven't certified or QA'd against it.
That makes sense.
So for the things that you're describing, I will, if anybody repeats this, I will deny it to the nth degree. But if you or have something else that's out there, there is the basis to say, hey, if it's adhering to the standards by the same token that was pointed out earlier, I think, where it was saying, hey, Kubernetes dropped Docker. Well, yeah, so what? That just means Kubernetes is doing the things that Docker was previously doing before. As long as that thing is staying compliant with the constructs of what the container expects in the standard way in which other things are going down the path, theoretically, okay, operative word, it should work. The BMC position, however, hopefully you can appreciate is, we currently don't have the cycles to test against all those different permutations to then put our name behind it to say that it absolutely certainly will work.
That's totally understandable too. So,
And then in the scenario like Phil is working with here, Proxmox is not a container orchestrator.
Yeah. Right.
Okay. So once Phil gets his hands on the containers that we are providing as part of the 2105, Phil, in theory, has the capacity to just take that container and throw it into Proxmox and say, Proxmox, please stand up 2 instances of the AR server, please stand up 3 instances of mid-tier. And he can get it working because it's a container. Yep. It can run in something that runs containers. Okay. The BMC position historically has been, we don't support that configuration. And if we determine that the problem that you're having is caused by the fact that you're running in an unsupported configuration, we might ask you to get yourself into a supported configuration to see whether or not the problem
to be able to provide support. Yeah, and that makes sense from a standardization. And again, back to the testing point, it's the same thing you guys have done with other OSs and different things that way. Yeah, it should work, but we haven't tested it, so we can't. So that's totally understandable from that perspective. And yeah, that makes sense. And again, you guys are making recommendations around this, and you're not going to be able to test every single flavor probably either. I mean, so that's totally understandable. Okay, appreciate the help, guys. That answers my questions.
But
one last thing
can I ask one question regarding the? I mean, we are all talking about these containers taking less resources because you don't have to stand up a new operating system for every virtual machine and so on. So theoretically, the container environment should be less consuming than the current environment.
You would think,
especially when you talk about
Yeah.
the consolidated server.
you would think.
Yeah, but and then what I wanted to check is that I'm running a very small production system, a remedy system. It's totally custom made, no ITS and not many definition files. So it doesn't take so much resources. I can really tune down my AR server to support this. And I have 2 users, so we are not very big. So that there are like functions in this new environment where I could tune down my resources for my pods or
So
containers or whatever to be to adapt to my situation, or many customers that I have that run custom applications and no ITSM?
So there is the roadmap plan. It is not the priority for right now, and I'll explain why in a second, but there is the roadmap plan to have a containerized footprint specifically for the Remedy platform, as opposed to the focus right now is around the service management solution space. And if you can appreciate the fact that there's a lion's share of customers where we have solutions that we sell, and sales reps want to get paid for some reason because they like going to Hawaii on their bonuses and all that other crap. The primary focus around the solutions and the footprint for the container is currently targeted around the full suite of products and the container footprint for that. However, it is absolutely, well, I should never say that word. It is on the roadmap for acknowledging that we have customers and a audience for there to be a Remedy platform footprint container that does not incorporate the other additional overhead components that involve the app. And we have some notably large customers where they just built their own solution and Remedy is the platform. Customers I can't mention, but you can probably guess because they sell you a lot of stuff and drop it off at your door, that basically they just use the Remedy platform as a Remedy platform, period, full stop. And so there is the intent on the roadmap. However, you will probably not hear a lot of information about that right now because we're just so focused on getting the solution platform in place and getting that sizing down. But please rest assured that it is absolutely on the roadmap for us to deliver against that for those pure Remedy platform options.
But at the moment, let's say we don't have a way to spin up an AR server without the ITSM definitions pushed onto the database. Or
the footprint that's being put out there right now is the solution footprint. But are you able to like configure the memory or whatever that, or the CPUs or whatever to these? Yeah. I mean, you can configure those. Yeah, go ahead.
Mishi, if when you get your hands on this container, when you open it up, you're going to find that it has all sorts of extra plug-in servers in there that you're not going to need.
Exactly.
So you can edit that container, delete all the stuff that you don't need, edit the config files to take the size down to what you want, create your own container off of that, and stand up a container off of that new image.
Just keep in mind, you'll have to do that. It's
not going to be supported.
Right.
but sure. This is fine, but I mean also for purposes of like putting some stuff on your laptop to build stuff. I mean,
but is the wording really correct? Because you can edit the container, but you cannot edit the image.
You can create containers from existing containers. You can create images from existing containers.
So what about the database layer though? I mean, all of the upgrade stuff and the things to make the database side happen are more focused around the entire solution, right? So how are you going to get your database set up to support a smaller or just a simple AR instance, right?
Well, Mishi's going to go into base mode and select everything ITSM and delete it in Dev Studio.
Exactly.
Probably.
Or I'm going to send him an AR database already cleaned up for him.
There you go.
Yeah, there's a lot of capabilities with this that are not in the pantheon of supported by BMC that are going to be capable and functional.
Yeah, we just need to get a hold of those containers so we can start bastardizing them up a little bit.
Yep.
Now there's one piece I wanted, because there was a question about is it okay to share Kubernetes nodes with other things that aren't Remedy? One thing I wanted to point out about Kubernetes is there's actually a recommendation that you have a Kubernetes node for Kubernetes cluster for dev, and a Kubernetes cluster for test, and a Kubernetes cluster for prod. Because just like you wouldn't necessarily, mix, throw all three of those databases onto the same database server, you would have a separate database server for each of those environments. The recommendation at minimum is separate namespace, but from a practical perspective, the recommendation is to actually have a separate cluster itself with different nodes that can be used.
Well, that's also so you can test upgrading the entire cluster if there's a new Kubernetes version released. So
exactly.
Yeah.
So from that stack perspective, we're not just talking one Kubernetes cluster. We're talking potentially 3 if you're running the recommended 3 environment configuration. And the absolute last thing I'm going to say on this, and I'm going to pass it back to to Bob, is there's another tool that sits on top of Kubernetes called Rancher, which is a Kubernetes cluster orchestrator. So while Kubernetes is managing your prod or your test or your dev environment, Rancher is managing your dev cluster, your test cluster, and your prod cluster. So just another tool on top of everything else. And I think I was given 45, and I think I've gone an hour and a half.
At least.
Typical.
So we didn't want to stop you. I mean, because it's obviously very engaging, and the fact that we've got still 18 people on the call. We had 23 people until just a few minutes ago. So LJ, thank you very much. Darius, thank you very much, and Cade, Jason and Mishi and Ryan and you guys. I mean, I appreciate being in the conversation. Now, here's a question. I was going to create a poll, but I'll just ask. Bob has this control panel that he's prepared to present, and we can either. He says it'll take 10 minutes. He can show it, or we can. I mean, we've gone over, but I mean, what do you guys want to do?
We can save it all the way till next year, or whatever y'all want to do.
Or Bob, you can do it at VRUG. I don't know. What do you want to do, Bob?
Yeah, it's not big enough to do at VRUG. It's too small.
Okay, Merrick has a fast technical question about Kubernetes. Go ahead, Merrick.
Yeah, LJ, it's not directly about BNC, but Kubernetes can manage nodes and pods. Okay, we spoke about this. It's everything on one virtual machine. Can the nodes be different virtual machines or different physical machines?
Yes.
Okay.
A node is nothing more than a addressable machine that has Kubernetes installed on it that Kubernetes can put pods in.
Okay. Okay. Because I played always with Minikube and I never reached this range of several virtual machines. Okay. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, they could be 2 virtual machines on the same bare metal. They could be 2 virtual machines on 2 different ones. It's really just an addressable machine that you have told Kubernetes, here is a machine to install pods on.
Okay. Okay. Thanks a lot.
So Darius, I'm going to ask, is there a way for us to be involved? I know BNC is still trying to come up with the specs and things, but I mean, I don't know if there's like a beta program or anything, because as has been mentioned, we'd love to get our hands on these containers and put them in these different environments that we have. I guess I could ask, maybe it's John Stevens Hall or whoever runs I don't know, maybe May on the beta stuff. I don't know. Are you aware of any opportunity for us to get involved, Darius or Elton?
Yeah, I would reach out to. I would go with your first line of contact. I think May would probably be a good place to point you in the right direction. I know that there was, you haven't heard much about this, but there was a 2105. 2102? No, 2105. There was a limited release, whichever the heck the limited release was.
2105.
So Darius, I've tried multiple times to get it. We didn't make it on the limited release.
Exactly.
And there was only a couple people that were done there. And everybody now is telling me we need to wait for GA because it was like supposed to happen 3 weeks ago, right?
Yeah,
So,
exactly. Yeah.
I don't think you're going to have much luck, Phil, but go ahead and try.
Yeah, no,
Okay.
I agree. That's where I was going to go because there was the formality of it, but then it was the cut was supposed to be wide, and then they started running it, and then they narrowed it made it very narrow because of some of the folks that were selected were very big participants in that early stage, so they limited the scale very quickly. But you're right; it's gotten to a point where it's gotten to being a GA channel. But I would reach out to May because I think really what you may want to start looking at is what's coming up with the 21.3 release, formerly known as 2108. But the 21.3 release is probably something that would be what I would be looking forward to based on because
from a beta perspective, yeah.
Yeah, from a beta perspective, yeah.
Okay, great.
But I would check with May.
Thanks.